the majority of the survivors, even to this day, would prefer to live nightmares for the rest of their lives than share that trauma with their offspring and their kids. They don't want to expose you to the horribleness that they had.
That's Dorothy Chow, the daughter of a Cambodian genocide survivor, Robert Chow. As a teenager, Robert survived the unthinkable during the Khmer Rouge regime: starvation, violence, torture, and trauma that very few people can understand. Dorothy decided that it was important for her and other survivors to hear Robert's story.
It's crazy to think that something that had happened 50 years ago, something that I had never experienced in my life, yet still somewhat lives in me. Generational trauma is a real thing.
I'm also the child of Cambodian immigrants who has lost a lot of family to the Khmer Rouge, and this is one of the most personal episodes to me. As a fellow second-generation Cambodian American, Dorothy realized that she couldn't just be quiet and ignore the elephant in the room, understanding how the genocide shaped her father and their relationship. And this led her and her father to start the podcast, Death in Cambodia, Life in America. This is a conversation that very few Cambodians are having. And as you'll see, it's with these courageous conversations that healing begins. Let's jump in. Today's guest is Dorothy Chow, and we're going to tackle the question, how do you get your parents, maybe your dads, to be vulnerable? How's it going, Dorothy?
Hi, thanks for having me. Good, how are you?
I'm so jazzed and I'm moved for today's conversation. Honored to be talking to you. Why don't you give a 1-minute background on yourself and we'll dive into the podcast.
Yeah. So hi, everybody. My name is Dorothy Chow, and I am the host and producer of the Death in Cambodia, Life in America podcast. I also, from that podcast project, had started 2 other projects called Khmer Courageous Conversations, which is an online safe space for second-generation Khmers. And I also started Survival Stories, which is essentially like an oral story collection, video collection for Khmer Rouge survivors out there who are willing to share. And then I guess on the side, I am also the COO of B&H Bakery Distributors. And so we, Khmer related. So within the donut industry, I distribute to all the donut shops within Northern California, their donut ingredients. Yeah.
Wow, so cool. And for our clarification for our listeners who are not familiar with the pronunciation, Khmer is the Cambodian way of saying Cambodia.
Yes.
Cambodian. So the podcast, Death in Cambodia, Life in America. And I was telling Dorothy, it's hard to interview a podcaster because they have, hundreds of hours of audio online, and you've kind of got to be selective of where you go. Time is not infinite. And Dorothy sent me a few of her favorite episodes, which is what I normally ask podcasters who I interview. But I'm like, I had a long flight. I had a 10-hour or 2 connecting flight. And I said, I'm just going to start on episode 0. And I think I downloaded 7 episodes. And I had my TV show that I'm binging on the side that I love, Boardwalk Empire, late to the game. And I listened to 8 straight hours of her, Dorothy, and her dad talking. And Kay, there was this voice, Kay, don't you want to go back to Boardwalk Empire? I'm like, no, I got it. I got to keep hearing. And I was moved, and we're going to talk all about that. We're going to talk about the podcast. But I figured the story is incredible. It's an interview series with your dad, Robert, and Dorothy and Robert are having a conversation in season 1. And to contextualize it, it takes place during the Khmer Rouge regime, the genocide, the civil war, the occupation, however you want to describe it, in the mid-70s in Cambodia, when Dorothy's dad, Robert, is a teenager and he's been displaced into these very difficult labor camps. So I want to hand over the mic to you. And I asked you to pick one of the stories that really kind of captures what was happening, and we can kind of use that as our launching point.
Yeah. So, the backstory to even taking these interviews really is, I grew up not really knowing about my father's history, and I think a lot of Cambodians probably have that same sentiment. But there was this one story when I was growing up in high school at the dinner table that my dad would occasionally, he'd sit there and he'd have his glass of wine and he'd take a few sips, and then we'd all be just, eating our dinner, forks clanking on the plate, and all of a sudden he'd say something crazy like I remember a time that I was starving at 12 years old, and everybody would just kind of stop at the dinner table and we'd just pause because we didn't really know what to do with that information. And so when I was going through the interviews with him and fleshing out his entire recollection of the Khmer Rouge and what had happened from 1975 to 1979, I finally caught the story that he was kind of alluding to back when I was in high school. And the Khmer Rouge, to paint a picture, it was a utopian, well, they were trying to achieve a utopian society, Cambodia, for 4 years. And they thought that getting rid of everything modern, getting rid of all the intellectuals, getting rid of everybody who was a government official, who was smart and educated, they started killing those people first. Essentially, it was a genocide. So everybody who was left was on really, really rationed portions of food. And you would only get one small bowl of rice a day, if that, probably watered down. And people were dying left and right. No medication. And in episode 7, to be specific, he noticed that the guy who was standing in line behind him, although everybody was hungry, the guy standing behind him was very, very sick, probably had malaria or something. And again, they didn't want to give Western medicine to anybody at that time. If you were sick, you died. So he, as hungry as he truly was, if you can imagine working like a 20-hour day with only one bowl of rice.
And he's 14.
And he's 14 years old. He looked down at his meal for the day, saw the man behind him, and decided to give his ration of the day to the man behind him who was very, very sick. And he breaks down because if you listen to the audio, you can truly hear him being transported back to that time. And you can hear he truly, truly was hungry too. He breaks down crying. And I grew up with a dad who was very rigid and was not very emotional at all. I think the only times I'd ever seen him cry was within this podcast room. And so it really humanized him for me, seeing him break down like that, and also reminded me or taught me that the man who raised me truly, truly knows what starvation is. And so it's just a snippet of what most Cambodians who had lived through that era had gone through.
Yeah. And what struck me too, when the man's dying, doesn't he thank your dad?
He does, yeah. So he, before he dies, because he didn't live, he says thank you for the food that you had given me. And I think most of us, and probably the majority of the people who lived in and grow up in a Western country, would have absolutely no idea what starvation truly is. And watching him kind of break down in front of me, telling that and recounting that story, it's just the emotions are just so palpable, like when you hear it, because it's something. There's something so human about that. Like I don't think when my dad gave that last bowl of rice, I don't think he knew that man was going to live. I think he probably didn't. I think he probably understood that he wasn't going to live, and he was starving. So there were so many moments through recording this podcast where I just got a crash course on what it is to be human.
Yeah. Wow. A crash. Yeah. Well said. And again, I was telling you earlier that, there's a lot of second, kids of first generation, kids of survivors, me being one of them, somewhat indirectly, because my dad did not have to go through the camps, but all his family did,
Mm-hmm.
and didn't survive. But this there's something like these survivors, a lot of them, I mean, men and women, but for me, I related to my dad, where similar, like my dad is stoic. He doesn't show any real emotion. I think
Right.
I saw him cry. Like I talked about my Cambodian heritage in like for my college application essay. And so I was like starting to get a little nosy with the
Yeah.
questions. And I think I
Yeah.
saw him cry there. And I don't know what it was like for you, but for us, I think you mentioned it earlier, it's like the elephant in the room, where it's kind of like what's the point of talking about it, right? It's such a tragic event, which honestly, I didn't even fully appreciate the tragedy of it until I listened to your podcast. So many lives have been lost in such a brutal, destructive way. And for what? And so just, and like any genocide, it's like, why? And so, but as kids, these are your parents, your father, you respect them. They obviously are, my dad's a boomer. Your dad's probably somewhere between a boomer, older Gen X. Um, and it's just that generation of men, forget like Cambodian men, just that generation of men, period,
Yep.
don't talk about their feelings and they don't
Yep.
connect and they don't cry in front of their kids, and it's awkward for everyone involved, and like in the chance that that they do. And so I guess I wanted to ask you, because I think everyone listening, whether your parents survived a tragedy or you just had a normal upbringing, I think that many of our listeners are definitely at this age where they're like, they see their parents getting older. They know there's a lot of family history, family lore, whether it's like cook recipes to jokes, through traditions, through tragedy, whatever. And everyone's kind of like, I know I should do it. There are even like services where, like you pay $100 and they send you some prompts and you record them and they send you back a book on your family.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's just so daunting and people don't do it. And I know I should do it and I haven't done it. And so I want to ask you, Dorothy, what came about, what came about in your head and your circumstances when you said, I need to get these stories out?
Yeah. Um, well, I think there's a difference between just preserving culture and preserving history, whether it be through recipes and sharing surviving a genocide. And the reason why I say that is because the majority of the survivors, even to this day, would prefer to live nightmares for the rest of their lives than share that trauma with their offspring and their kids. And the only reason why I know about this is because I've also had trauma-informed therapists that I've interviewed about who have studied trauma, and a lot of them have said the majority of them don't want to share with you because they don't want to taint you. They don't want to expose you to the horribleness that they had. They'd rather keep it in them
Yeah.
than to give that to you. They want to protect us from that. And so I want to preface by saying the majority of the success also with me capturing my father's story is the fact that he was even willing to share.
Yeah.
The majority of survivors out there still would prefer not to go back to that place because it is so difficult. I mean, they've spent the past 50 years pushing that door closed and keeping it shut. And so reliving that and opening that door again and letting the floodgates just kind of go is something that not a lot of survivors have the strength to really go back and
Yeah.
do. And so, I think the only reason why my dad was willing to share was because I had set up an incredibly safe space for him. Like, I took this very seriously. I think that if I would have just sat there casually and been like, "Hey dad, like, share with me about the time that you saw, a bunch of dead people in a pile." Like, I don't think that he would go to that place.
Mhm.
But on top of the fact that he had always just been more of an open person, I think it was truly when he saw my setup that I was truly trying to take this seriously. I'm trying to honor his story, and I tried I'm creating a space where he doesn't have to feel crazy or feel judged. I think that is probably one of the most important things that people have to remember. A lot of survivors understand that they had survived something really, really ridiculous. And their greatest fear is sharing it with people who don't understand and looking at them as if they're crazy, because so there's a lot of fear around sharing because it's who am I sharing with? Is this person going to judge me? And so there's so many different layers when it comes to capturing your parents' story, especially if it's something as traumatic as a genocide.
Yeah. And what inspired you to want to do it? And then kind of in parallel in a public way. I think I would imagine me saying to my dad, like, "Hey, dad, like, setting up the safe space and the recording, and this is what I'm going to ask you, and all that." He's like, "Why would I want this to to exist on the internet where I don't know who's going to see it and so on?" So I guess what inspired you? I'd really love to hear that like spark in your own mind.
Yeah, yeah. So I'd always been interested in history. That was always my favorite subject, even growing up. And in college, I like got a history minor just because I loved studying history, and so um, I had that curiosity already kind of embedded in me. And I remember those moments from high school on the dinner table where we would sit down, and I think like most Cambodian Americans just kind of tiptoe around the topic because one, we don't know how to approach it, and we don't want to re-traumatize our parents who had we already get the sense that this is something very, very tragic and deep. So not trying to re-traumatize them. And then two, as I got my history minor in college, I started realizing that I had never been formally taught about the Khmer Rouge. Like, I've never been formally taught.
Mhm.
We learned about the Vietnam War and the American involvement there, but I started finding it very strange that something that had happened in the 70s, which is really not that long ago, and as horrible as what I can feel in my own household, like the trauma that and the PTSD that I feel like my dad embodies. How is it that we don't learn or hear about it in history books? And so I moved home to take over the business that I'm doing now. And I had all this time with him. And during COVID, we had nothing to do. Everything was on lockdown. And I was like, you know what? Let me see in what way I can try to capture his story. I'm close to home now. And I thought about starting a blog, but I wasn't comfortable enough in my writing skills. And I was like, okay, well, what else can I do that I can feel confident enough by capturing his story? And I just uh, Googled literally how to start a podcast and went to Home Depot, bought one of those like plastic tables and like two plastic chairs, I just got a few mics on Amazon and cranked it to the side of the plastic table, um, hooked it up, and, pressed record. And I remember the first time when he saw my podcast setup, I said, "Hey, Pa, come over. Why don't you just check this out? And why don't we give this a shot and see where this goes?" And he walked in and he was like, "Oh, we're really doing this." And I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, just sit down. Let's just give this a shot. We'll see how this goes." And the moment that I clicked record, I was shocked by how he was able to recall the minute details from something that happened 45, 50 years ago. And he was like, "Yeah, there was this mat that was like 6 foot by 4 feet. And then we would cut down, 500 something trees." And I'm like, the numbers in his head, it was as if it literally happened yesterday. And I was shocked that he had all this memory in his head.
Mhm.
Um, by the third episode, I think I had mentioned to you prior to this, but by the third episode that I had released this out, we had gone viral. I had made an Instagram page for us, and I made like 2 reels, and both of the reels just went crazy. And um, it was literally just a reel about, yes, my dad survived the Khmer Rouge. We're starting a podcast. We're talking about this. And every time we sat down in that room to recollect another part of the story, I can see him transporting back to being a 14-year-old boy running through the jungle, running for his life, fighting, finding rats, and working all day, staying silent in this horrible 4-year regime that he had to survive and go through. And it it was truly life changing for the both of us. We started off thinking that these small recordings were just going to be something that I was going to keep to share with my future grandkids one day, or his future grandkids, and that they would remember a piece of history that history books don't teach us. And it ended up touching so many lives, so many Cambodians around the world.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I was telling you, I was on the plane, binge listening. I was bawling, laughing because your dad is so fucking funny. Also, and like I was inspired too because he's so entrepreneurial. Where
Yeah.
he's just like him and your grandmother, I guess.
Yeah.
Like they
Yeah.
like were playing like 4D chess in
Yes.
this like without eating and I forget too because my dad didn't go through this. I forget the time period of it, like how long it was.
Yeah.
And that's where there with your dad with like, and this was like 1 year and 17 days later. I'm like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's so precise.
Yeah.
Um,
And there's no clocks, no digital phone that you have to like check the days. How many days has this been going on? And when you're working in the sun, with just death all around you, I think he took everyone back to that period. And I think there is something really incredible about listening to it, like it being audio, because it adds another layer. It's different than just reading a history book. Like you
totally.
can feel like you're actually there with him.
Mhm.
And I mean, even to this day, we have in total, what, 45 episodes, each episode about 30 to 45 minutes long. And it is currently the largest audio recollection from any Khmer Rouge survivor that's just living out
Really?
there. Yeah, yeah. Because most interviews that you would find from Cambodian survivors are maybe just about an hour long. They would
Yeah.
sit down and the person would recount the whole thing in 1 hour. This is 45 hours
Yeah.
almost. And so the details that my dad was able to share with me um, add a whole nother layer to exactly what they lived through. And I think it's so needed. There's
Yeah.
so many of us, it's, Cambodian Americans, Cambodian French, Cambodian Australian, who live with parents or had grown up with parents with unresolved PTSD. And unresolved PTSD um, comes out in different ways. A lot of Cambodian people and a lot of Cambodian kids had grown up with parents who had, drug addiction,
Yeah.
alcohol
Tons of
issues,
alcoholism I've seen.
alcoholism, domestic violence in the household, all these different things that they had to grow up with because their parents had literally just survived 4 years of a genocide and then got propped into America, propped into Australia, and was
Yeah.
like, there we go. Figure it out.
Yeah.
And um, and a lot of us, of children of refugees, have had to deal with that and grow up with resentment, I believe, because they never truly got to understand that their parents had
Yeah.
undiagnosed PTSD. Because without that bridge, without that education, without that knowledge of exactly how bad it was, it's very
Yeah.
easy for us kids to be like, my dad's absolutely crazy, and
Yeah.
my mom's like crazy as well, and I'm not
Uh,
talking to them, I'm not dealing with them.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
what does that do for me? The question I always pose is, what does that do to a generation?
Yeah.
you know um the generational trauma just keeps getting passed down if we
Mhm.
don't actually address that this is something that deserves a platform.
Yeah.
This is something that deserves a paragraph in a history book. That
Mhm.
our parents had survived something that 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 deserves validation.
Yeah. No, I don't think, and again, having kind of tangentially been exposed to all this stuff for many, many, I'm almost 46.
Hmm.
Um, like I know the story, I know that he's like, he would always say, is like, we used to eat, I mean, this was before, we used to eat every single grain of rice off of our plate.
Hmm.
And my parents still try to impose that on my 3/8 Cambodian, 5/8 Caucasian kids. And they're like, what the fuck is wrong with
Yeah.
my grandparents? And I just kind of, I'm like, oh, it's this, it's like the weird thing from before. And then when you hear, and again, my dad did not go through the camps.
Yep.
When you hear the stories of the like one bowl of like you work 20 hours, you're 14 years old, you're separated from your parents, you eat one bowl of like basically water with a little bit of rice and salt
Yep.
in it for 4 years. I'm like, oh, like everything just makes so much more sense.
Yeah.
And and so I was wondering when you asked your dad to do this, you were serious, you were creating a safe space and like safe container for it, you're his daughter. Why do you think he said yes? Because I know if it was public, my dad would say no. And I think many Cambodian kids, parents would be like, public, no.
Yeah, he had mentioned a few times before that he was looking to capture his story in some way, and a few times he had found ghostwriters who would essentially take your story and turn it into a book. And I remember one time during that time period, he had hired somebody to write a small snippet of his story so he would sit down and be interviewed by the person. And I'd read the manuscript and I was like, this is like the driest thing that I had ever read. I'm like, this author is not capturing the story in the way that it's supposed to be captured. I'm like, there's this is a insanely incredible story, and the way that they're writing it does not really give it the color that it deserves. And I was like, no, Ba, like you can't go with this author person. So I can see him actively trying.
Yep.
And so I knew that he did have a desire to share his story. I just needed to provide the right kind of container in the environment. And I think there's another thing to be said. I think the reason why, if I look back at it now, the reason why that he's been able to be so vulnerable to me is because it was me.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, he's sitting down and he's sharing it with his daughter, who he knows is not somebody who's going to take it and take advantage of the story or put him in a light that's going to make him seem crazy or judged. And so it ended up being perfect in that way, because I believe had a random person or a reporter had sat down with him and tried to interview him, he probably would have answered them in very different ways. I don't think he would have gone to the vulnerable places that he went to with another person had it not been like for me, like interviewing him.
No, you're spot on. And you had all the elements, right? The trust, the relationship, and also the time. I mean, having just binged it, like what reporter is going to spend 45 hours, or I don't know how many hours he ended up spending, but
Yeah.
that's like days worth of talking to any subject on their story. I wanted to ask, how did this project change you, and how did it change him, and who else did it change? And feel free to pick which angle you want to go with first.
Yeah. Well, at the end of recording, I remember when we were kind of getting close to the final episodes, and this would be, season 1 is dedicated to his life, his survival in Cambodia. That's why it's called Death in Cambodia, Life in America. So season 1 is about the Khmer Rouge and how he survived. Season 2 is when he steps off the plane and he lands in Oregon, where his sponsors were. And it takes you through this journey of how surviving the Khmer Rouge and how surviving a genocide fueled his American entrepreneurship, because they say the majority of CEOs and entrepreneurs in America are immigrants. My dad definitely took the pain and the trauma that he had gone through in his early teenage years and used that as a propeller through
I haven't
his
even gotten to
entire
that
life.
part, but I could tell. Like I was getting like business. I listen to like
Yeah.
business
Business
motivation podcasts,
Right,
and
right.
I'm like crying, and then like thinking about my dad, and I'm like, I need to like be more serious about my career, like all at the same time.
Yeah. And I remember us kind of getting towards the final episodes, because at that point we get closer and closer to present day. And I start getting emotional because the very, very last episode I start crying because I say, Ba, I can't believe that after all of this time, and this is probably 8 months of recording, okay, because it's every Sunday. So in total, the project with him was around 8 months. I was like, I can't believe, I can't believe like this newfound like perspective that I have on like life and you. And he says this when we finish recording. I turn off the mic, so you won't, I don't think you would hear this part. Maybe you will. But he goes, hey, baby. I'm the youngest, so he calls me baby. He's like, baby, that's something that's funny. About 2 weeks ago, I stopped having nightmares. He says, he says, I I usually get these nightmares, and every time they probably come like once a week, sometimes even more, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night, but I'd always be back I'd be back in the middle of the jungle. I'd be back in the Khmer Rouge every single nightmare. And he's like, you know what's funny? I stopped having nightmares about 2-3 weeks ago. And this is after 8 months of fleshing out every single detail of what
Every
he had done.
Sunday.
Every Sunday. It was repetitive. Every Sunday, we'd go through the story. He'd face all of these memories that he had been stowing away for so long. And after about 8 months of doing that, he was able to find some peace, to find some healing. And I remember us like sitting there just like shocked, because we did not set out at all to start this to heal him, to heal that part of him. But through the process of fleshing it out, through the process of facing the demons in his head, he was able to let all that trauma go.
Wow.
And honestly, that was I mean, it's not about the list, this, you know, we've been featured on like CBS and all these fancy news segments and international news, and I get, you know, people from around the world who are also very important, but that moment right there was everything. If I could just have that moment from this entire podcast, I would be, that'd be it. That would be it for me.
Wow. Dorothy, I mean, just like as a child of a Cambodian, who's suffered a lot, and just knowing so many of our people, in our generation that have, like you said, dealt with that being not expressed. It's just like the amount of, like, that amount of healing is, obviously it heals the most important person, which is the person that experienced the pain. But it like has ripple effects in ways that, like, I'm sure neither of us will ever be able to imagine. I mean, you're seeing it with the success of your podcast. I experienced it yesterday. I'm playing, listening. I'm like, something in me is awakened. And, I've been reconnecting. I did an episode. I've been reconnecting to my Cambodian heritage over the past couple of years, because I kind of like stiff-armed it. I'm like, I'm a quarter white. It's just, I can pass for something else. I'm just like, I'm just going to lean into that, and just like, they don't want to tell the story, so I'm not going to explain the story, and I'm just going to like be something else in your eyes. I'll be Latino, I'll be Hawaiian. Like, I don't need to, you just leave me alone. Like, it's like, let's just not talk about that. And then to be sitting on this plane being like bawling, and just, again, I don't even know, we'll have to talk in 6 months or in a year, but like something really was awake. And I tell one of my therapists tells me, she's like, in you, me, she's like, I see a lot of, she calls it ancestral strength. And I know so many kids, like, again, like my Cambodian peers, and they are so driven and so hungry and so smart. And there's just something, and we see it in our parents, right? Like your dad, my dad, and, like, it's just our moms. And there's just this determination and this strength, which, as I listen to your dad's story, it's like, it literally is a story like of life and death. Like, if you did not have that strength, you would die.
Yeah.
Full stop. And to see, like, there's second order effects of this stuff on kids, on their kids, their grandkids. And it just, just the ripple of like one person healing. And that's like so incredible that you didn't even set out to heal, and there was healing. What about for you?
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people know this. I had mentioned it, before we pressed record as well, but at the very same time that the episodes were being released every Sunday, the next day, Monday, I would have therapy because that was the only way that I was able to process and digest what I was hearing from the day before. And there was no way I would have gone through this process had I didn't have help, because everyone else, the public, is digesting the story as I am. So I am busy launching the episodes, editing all the episodes. I touched all of my father's story like nobody else edited it but me. And that was very, very important to me, that I kept to his most authentic voice. I was very, very picky about everything around his voice and his story. And so, I would record, have 5 days to edit, post social media, and then do it again every single week for 8 months. And I needed somebody to help me process everything, because I too feel like when I first started the podcast, my relationship with my father wasn't fantastic. Wasn't bad, but it definitely had its own kind of thorns of resentment from my teenage years and being put to work early. They consider me a donut kid. So I started working since I was like 9 years old at a donut shop. I probably knew how to like clear a cash register and write a schedule by 10. So, there's a lot of resentment with that, because you don't get to sign up for Girl Scouts and you have to give up your weekends to work the shop because those are the busiest days. And, you see the rest of everybody else and the kids having fun. And that on top of many other things, we didn't communicate, he didn't show his emotions. So I had my own issues that I had to deal with, and digesting my father's story every single Sunday, I needed help. So it would be Sunday record, Monday therapy, Sunday record, Monday therapy. And at the end of the recordings, I can honestly say that I finally am able to look at my father like a human being than just this like horrible, I don't want to say horrible, but just strict figure in my life that I didn't understand. And I needed this communication. I needed this education to teach me and help me build empathy for what all these survivors had gone through. Without that, I think I would still be resentful. I think our relationship, and as people grow into adults, we only drift further away from our parents. I
Yeah.
feel like only we spend less and less time with them. And so without that extra bridge, um, I would not be as close with my father. And, on top of that, I found this newfound sense of purpose in me. I saw the healing powers of storytelling. I mean, we witnessed it right before our eyes, and we stumbled upon it like without even trying. That the process of sitting down and being vulnerable with somebody actually can heal. And I thought that was incredible. I thought that was fascinating. And immediately after he said that, I was like, oh my gosh, we need to like recreate this for all the other survivors out there. Like, how do we make safe spaces around to capture the stories that we can? And I also understood that all the negative voices in my head that I feel like I grew up with as and got louder as an adult, because things that I had struggled with, such as, just like not enoughness and, a negative voice in my head, telling me I'm not good enough and I need to work harder, I need to be better, all these different things
Your
come.
head or my head?
Oh, and
I
everybody's
mean,
on.
literally, like I've probably said it in those words in that order.
Really, I
Yes.
mean, it's so common for people who and kids who had grown up with parents who had survived something as terrible, because you we, especially for the ones that actually did go through the Khmer Rouge, there is a sense of like survivor's guilt that my dad talks about, that, wow, everybody else died, like why did I get to live? And if I get to live and my kids get to live, we need to make sure that this isn't in vain. And that is very, very apparent in many children of refugees, this sense of like, I like my parents actually like
Yeah.
starved for me to live, or
Mhm.
my family died so that I could live, so I need to make sure that I am perfect essentially, and that I
Mhm.
am not taking 1 minute of this life, especially this life in America, for
Yep.
granted. um
Mhm.
and so that is constantly pulsating through our bodies and our minds. And I always was curious about that. Like, and it felt like it only got worse as I got older. It's like,
Same.
what is this like? Like, what is this voice in my head? Why am I feeling so different from everybody else? And it all finally clicked when I learned the full story. When I had learned, oh my God, my dad has seen death, starvation, he has seen hell on earth. So I can completely understand why he is the way he is, why he raised me the way he raised me. I mean, granted, if I survived a genocide like that, I don't know how I would come out. I don't think I would be um emotionally capable of raising the kid in the same way as if I didn't. There's just some things that are life changing, um and it finally made me look at my dad and be like, like I understand you now.
Mhm. And I'll tell you, like, I felt that about my dad listening to you talk. And I heard my dad's stories and, our uncles and aunts' stories
Right.
in it. And I learned the history lesson that, honest, like I was ashamed that I didn't even know the history. I think, like ChatGPT was the best thing for me in Cambodian history because I could ask questions without being embarrassed that I couldn't situate, this place or this event or what have you without the shame of like similar thing. Like it was the most horrific thing that ever happened to your ancestors. Like, and you don't even know like the dates that which it happened, and so
I mean, I
I,
think you
I,
I think
yeah,
you should give yourself grace, because that is exactly the problem, right? Like, it's just not taught and nobody says anything. And I think you'll find a lot more people have your experience than not. But yet we grow up and we're like, what is this thing that I feel like I carry? Like, what is this difference in me that is like, what is that? And we
yeah,
just don't know. And we question it. And then it takes that education for it to make sense.
yeah, yeah. No, and I think I might have said this again, but like as I was listening, it's like everything just makes more sense. Like
Hmm.
it
Yeah.
just makes more sense. Um, what you said that this process helped you find more, connect you deeper to your purpose. How would you compare, your purpose or lack thereof? Again, I don't want to insinuate anything,
Hmm.
like before versus after, and where has the success of this podcast taken you personally?
Yeah. Well, I I just never felt a passion for anything like this before in my life. I don't think I've always been a driven person. I mean, no doubt. I've always been goal driven and I wanted to succeed. But there's something about what had happened during that recording session, something about how this entire process had not only got me more in touch with who I am, but just seeing the way that it was starting to ripple effect to my listeners, like you sitting here and saying that. I just think it's so important for us to start having these conversations and start peeling back a few of the onion layers that so many of us had been maneuvering through life, kind of tiptoeing around. Because I don't think, look, this silence, like the way that we've been trying to handle this situation with this whole silence thing, I don't think it's working. Like I don't think it's benefiting anybody to
Yeah.
just continue this silence, and we're all just acting like it never happened, like history books don't talk about it, our parents don't talk about it, and we just keep passing that down. I don't think that's doing us any favors,
Yeah.
and I think it's only causing more harm. And the way that I have felt so much more empathy for my dad and for our generation after this only makes me want to like recreate this for other people. And so, um, the Khmer Courageous Conversation sessions, I host it monthly. I have partnered with a PhD Cambodian licensed therapist. He's out of UC Santa Barbara. And once a month, we sit down virtually, absolutely free, and invite any Cambodians to log on, and we talk and have these conversations. Like, and it's wild to think because I always have international people log on from like Cambodia, Canada, and it doesn't matter what country you landed in, Australia,
Yeah.
we all feel the same. We
Yeah.
all have this sense of like not enoughness, of this sense of like, I need to constantly be working, this sense of running. But it's
Yeah.
like, why am I running? Where am I
Mhm.
running towards? What am I running from? And I know, I know that without the explanation, it's not good for us. Like to continue
Yeah.
running without understanding why. And so it's just so fulfilling to me. I'm not saying I'm out here completely healing people, but it's so, so fulfilling and satisfying to know that I'm able to provide spaces where people can start learning how to understand themselves a little bit better. Um, and when I mentioned also recreating the story, the healing for the survivors, we have started this program called Survivor Stories. And essentially, any Cambodian survivor within the US, as long as you fly to the Bay Area, we will cover your video costs and we will cover basically all the costs to capture a video of my father interviewing the survivor. And so the reason we set it up that way is so for the first time, these survivors can talk with a fellow survivor. And it creates this space and this vulnerability to allow that person to like shed, because they don't want to be interviewed by people like us. They don't want
Yeah.
this little Western second generation probing at their history. It's different. I was able to do it with my dad, but that's because that's my dad,
Yeah.
you know? But when you have a survivor who had survived with you, somebody who had gone through the tragic atrocities with you, there's a second layer of understanding. Um, my dad also conducts the interview in Khmer in Cambodian, so they can
Oh, yeah.
speak and describe it in their own language. I mean, I think people forget that, a big part of this lack of communication is honestly, there's also a language
Yeah.
barrier. I don't speak Cambodian, but I bet
I
you
don't
that,
either.
yeah, so, our parents maybe don't even know the word vulnerability in
Yeah.
English. Like they don't know how to even describe their experience in English. And we
So,
don't know how to understand it in Cambodian.
yeah,
So there's so many different layers here. So that's, the whole thing about healing and education. Those are the two things that I'm most passionate about.
that's incredible. And my last question is, did this experience change your kind of broader understanding or perspective on like broader human suffering at all?
Most definitely. Um, I I think if anything, it taught me about human suffering, but more importantly, taught me about human strength. And both go hand in hand. You need the suffering in order to see the strength, and you need the strength. They're not, they're go hand in hand.
Yeah.
They need each other. Um, I just I I just when people talk about like genocides and stuff not being able to exist in other places, I I find it I have another sense of understanding behind that it can absolutely happen. Um, and not only that, but I have felt in my body the after effects of something, surviving that. I never had to starve in my entire life. I've never had a reason to run for my life, but yet I still feel a sense of a sense of um like like a buzzing sense of running within me. And it's crazy to think that something that had happened 50 years ago, something that I had never experienced in my life, yet still somewhat lives in me. And it's generational trauma is a real thing, I don't there's obviously different layers of it, but it's something that is definitely living. And they talk about Holocaust survivors dealing with the same thing, um, which makes absolute sense. But I just think that it is it is time that people recognize the Khmer Rouge as well. Like the survivors also deserve their validation, and so it's I have a way bigger heart, a way
Mm,
bigger sense of understanding of what it means to be human,
yeah.
because of this experience.
Mhm. Yeah. And it's, as you're talking, I was thinking, because like even through it all, there were so many moments of hope. There were so many moments of like your dad was so hopeful throughout it. I mean, there were moments when he wasn't. There were so many moments of humanity, right? Like the story you started off with at the beginning. There were so many other versions of that. And it was like, amidst all of that cruelty and suffering, to still see, not even basic, but to still see humanity shine through was just something that I couldn't fathom until I was hearing it kind of firsthand.
Yeah, I remember I remember asking him when he was explaining one of the darkest moments. I was like, "Is hope good?" And he goes, "Hope is good." He said, "Hope is good. Sometimes hope is all you have." And there were many people who gave up.
Yep.
There were many people who I'd heard they stopped eating, they stopped fighting. And obviously, if you stop eating, if you stop physically feeding yourself, like you will die. They stopped hunting. They stopped trying. They stopped hoping. And you think in the animal world, I'm sure logically it would make sense to just end the suffering when you can. But that's not what makes us human, you know? So many times within the story where my dad's it almost felt like a miracle in the ways that people came out of nowhere to help him,
Mhm.
even though at their own risk, at their own
It's crazy.
risk of life. Like people, if the people had found out that they had helped him in that way, they would be killed as well. And yet us humans, even in the darkness, we find that hope. We help each other where we can. My grandmother in the kitchen, um, hiding an extra spoonful of rice and hiding my Aunt Amanda behind the cabinet so that my Aunt Amanda wouldn't get taken away. And it was worse for girls, you know. I mean, you can imagine it. I think you mentioned you have a daughter. It was way worse for girls because of, you know, there were horrible things that happened in that 4-year period. Um and my grandma knew that, right? I have a young pretty daughter. Like I'm going to hide her here so that we can keep
Mhm.
her safe, and I'd rather just have her um you know, ration food out or find a way. And so it's yeah, I just, as I said before, a crash course on humanity
Mhm.
and the strength of humans even in the darkest hours.
Yeah. Well, that is a fitting ending. And again, Dorothy, I want to thank you. I want to thank your dad, Robert. I was moved beyond, again, beyond words. And it's incredible what you're doing. I'm so glad I stumbled upon, you on Instagram. And yeah, I'm excited to continue to learn from you and follow your guys' work and journey. And just thank you. It's just
Thank
really,
you.
really incredible.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Where we'll put all the links in, but where can folks go find the podcast, find the different conversations, learn more about you?
Yeah, so everything is on our website, www.deathincambodiapodcast.com, but you can also find us on Instagram. All the Khmer Courageous conversations are posted on Eventbrite. So the only thing, it's absolutely free. If you have any Cambodian listeners out there, you just got to be Cambodian. And yeah, so everything is on there, and you can find the podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you can listen to podcasts.
So thank you so much, Dorothy.
Thank you.